So you're a Bayer in the late 1800s. Started by two German friends in the textile industry, back then Bayer was nothing more than a small company that made colored dyes. But unfortunately, there's only so much money you can make selling colorful but expensive dyes to European royalty. And since you only knew how to make one dye color, purple, you weren't exactly swimming in expansion opportunities. But luckily, you had a brilliant idea. You were already messing around with all sorts of chemicals, so why limit yourself to just making dye? Why not see what else you could invent by throwing a little bit of this and a little bit of that into a test tube and shaking it really hard? And that's when you stumbled across something amazing. A chemical compound called acetylsalicylic acid. Try saying that 5 times fast. Better known by its brand name, aspirin. And as it turns out, aspirin is an incredibly useful, sometimes life-saving drug. You've hit the jackpot. You should have been just another dye company that bit the dust once dyes became dirt cheap and available to everyone. But instead, you created one of the most useful, in-demand drugs in the world. And there was no looking back now. Thanks to aspirin, you were making serious money. And for years, life was good. And you went on to invent a whole bunch of other bestsellers. Everything from heroin to painkillers that also cause kidney damage and cancer. And yes, you heard me right, you were the ones to bring heroin to the masses. But we'll get to that later. By the early 1900s, you were doing quite well for yourself. But unfortunately, you were a budding startup in 20th century Germany. Which meant just as you were starting to really pull in the big bucks, this happened. Ah yes, nothing makes a small business shrivel and die faster than, I don't know, a world war. But you weren't just any small business. You were the guys behind heroin and cancer-causing painkillers, for crying out loud. War was just another swing in the market that you could take full advantage of. And so you did. You threw caution and morality to the wind, and you made it your goal to make as much money as possible no matter the cost. Translation? You teamed up with the Nazis and did some of the most horrifying stuff we've ever covered on this channel. This first taste of pure evil, the kind of evil that makes you a billion-dollar company in just a few short years, what can I say, it was as addictive as the heroin you were selling. By the time World War I ended, you weren't just another small chemical company. You were a pharmaceutical giant with a reputation for making anything for the right price, and I really do mean anything. So when Hitler started making waves around the 1930s, when he was looking for some powerful chemicals to do the dirty work for him, well, who better to step up to the plate than little old you? Within the span of a few decades, you went from an innocent little dye manufacturer to one of the most powerful chemical companies in the world with a specialty in enabling ethnic cleansing. But nothing lasts forever. Not even the billions you made powering Hitler's bloodthirsty rampage across Europe. So obviously, once the war ended and your side lost, you were punished, right? You were forced to take a good look in the mirror, realize the error of your ways, and make amends for all the lives you ended and all the people you helped terrorize. Not so much. As it turns out, like so many other corporate giants, you were just too rich, too powerful, and too big to fail. So instead of being punished for what you did, you were actually rewarded. By everyone, including the winning side. And with that one decision, the decision to let you off scot-free after literally making the Holocaust possible, the world inadvertently created the most evil, money-hungry corporation on the planet. We've covered a lot of evil companies on this channel, but this one might just take the cake. Stay dangerous, and this is the unfathomable evil of Bayer. Every supervillain has an origin story. As Bayer, yours started in Germany in 1863. But back then, you weren't a money-hungry, all-powerful mega corporation yet. You were just a small business started by two ambitious friends, Frederick Bayer and Johann Westcott. Bayer and Westcott weren't exactly aiming for world domination at this point. Their big dream was simply to make the brightest, most appealing synthetic dyes to sell to the rich and royal. See, back in the 1800s, synthetic dyes like the ones in almost all of our clothes today had only just been discovered. Before that, people were dyeing their clothes with dried and crushed plants, insects, and sometimes even mud. The process was smelly, long, and took an insane amount of work. So naturally, only the richest of the rich could afford to look fashionable in their blues, greens, and reds. Everyone else just wore clothes the color of whatever it was made of, which in most cases was this boring brownish color that was probably white at some point, but not anymore. In 1856, William Perkin, a British chemist, accidentally created mauveine, a bright, shiny synthetic purple dye that would change everything. None of those other bug and mud dyed clothes could get anywhere close to the brightness and richness of Perkin's mauveine. And soon enough, dyers were diluting mauveine into all sorts of other purples, and Europe's elite couldn't get enough of it. Wearing purple clothes became the first ever international fashion trend. and mauve became the Gucci belt of the 19th century. If you weren't wearing it, who even were you? William Perkin may have cornered the mauving market in England, but as Bayer, you were operating in the heart of all the biggest, richest empires Europe had ever seen, and you wanted to cash in on the purple craze as well. So your two founding fathers, Friedrich Bayer and Johann Westcott, got to work. Over the next few years, you pumped out every shade of purple dye imaginable. By 1866, you had already outgrown your tiny startup, so you started expanding your operations all over Germany. Life was good. But like all fashion trends, the craze over purple couldn't last forever, and by the 1870s, so many other people had started producing synthetic dyes that it just wasn't as appealing to the rich and powerful anymore. Even peasants were starting to wear colorful clothing now. So slowly, the demand for your high-quality purples was drying up, and as Bayer, you were in real trouble. You had devoted all your time, all your money, all your effort into synthetic dyes, and now your entire business was being threatened. It also didn't help that both your founders had also died, leaving the company in the hands of Karl Rumpf. Rumpf tried selling Bayer stock to the public to keep the company going, but he knew it wasn't going to be enough. If you were going to keep growing, your business interests would have to expand. So Rumpf used the money you made from going public to hire as many chemistry PhD students as he could, hoping that one of them would discover the next big thing in the synthetic dye industry. And one of these graduates was a guy named Karl Duisberg. Little did Rumpf know that by hiring Karl Duisberg in 1884, it would be a decision that changed the course of history forever. Long before you could just pop a pill to get rid of a nasty headache or toothache, finding something to numb your pain was a lot more complicated. People relied on natural remedies to take the edge off, and one of the most popular choices was willow bark tea. All you had to do was brew some willow bark, drink the tea, and wait for sweet relief. Or at least that was the idea. Because in reality, willow bark tea tasted disgusting. And all that wonderful pain-killing power came with a long list of even worse side effects. Stomach aches, ulcers, nausea, vomiting, internal bleeding, skin rashes, kidney inflammation, and the list just goes on. Willow bark was far from the miracle painkiller everyone hoped for, but it was better than nothing, right? But luckily, people wouldn't have to down a bitter tea and hope for the best much longer, because as Bayer, you had made a name for yourself in taking good ideas and making them just a little bit better. So why couldn't you do the same with willow bark? Your purple dye profits were drying up, and you needed to expand into something new or risk bankruptcy. So you thought to yourself, we might as well give this whole pharmaceutical thing a try. And one of the biggest supporters in this change was Karl Duisberg. When Duisberg joined you, he was just 23 years old, which according to global standards back then was actually around the same age people started thinking about retirement. You know, enjoy the last decade of your life before you died a horrifying death from cholera or typhoid fever. Well, Karl Duisberg had no plans of retiring or dying anytime soon. He took a look at your dye operations and thought, yeah, dyes are cool and all, but you have so much potential to do more. Within his first few years at Bayer, Duisberg managed to create a red dye that could be sold without violating any other patents on similar dyes. As your star chemist, Rumpf decided it was time to see what else Duisberg had up his sleeve. So he tasked him with looking for new products Bayer could take on from the chemicals they already used. Around the same time, other German companies had discovered the magic of creating medicine from the same stuff used to make dyes, so Duisberg dove headfirst into the opportunity. Progress was slow, but Duisberg managed to keep in your good graces. So when Rumpf died in 1889, at the ripe old age of 50, Duisberg was named the next leader of Bayer. And Duisberg wasted no time devoting all of Bayer's resources to pharmaceuticals, and it quickly started paying off. Duisberg redirected all the best scientists to studying the properties of willow bark and figuring out how to make it safer and less disgusting to use. And by 1899, you finally had a winner, acetylsalicylic acid, better known as aspirin. You had created the world's very first wonder drug, and it became an instant bestseller. Aspirin had all the pain-killing power of the strongest willow bark tea you could ever drink, minus all the nasty side effects. Even better, it did more than just cure headaches. It reduced fever, took away toothaches, muscle pain, pretty much any ache or pain in existence. And even better, it was cheap. Like anyone with a job could probably afford this kind of cheap. And people couldn't get enough of this stuff. Karl Duisberg had brought you back from the brink of bankruptcy and turned Bayer into a money-making machine, all thanks to this little white pill. But unlike your founders, Duisberg wasn't satisfied with just one massively successful drug. If you want to turn aspirin into a global bestseller, who's to say you couldn't do the same thing with all sorts of other drugs? I mean, you were the most trusted pharmaceutical company at the time, you had millions ready to invest in only the most powerful profitable drugs in existence. What could possibly go wrong? As Bayer, you were riding high on your wave of money and fame after bringing aspirin to the masses, but it just wasn't enough. Far from the innocent little dye company you once were, Carl Duisberg had transformed you into a money-hungry pharmaceutical powerhouse, the granddaddy of Big Pharma as we know it. And you weren't satisfied with just curing headaches? If you could turn disgusting, dangerous willow bark into a safe, convenient little pill, why couldn't you do the same with all the other dangerous drugs out there? And one of the most dangerous yet useful drugs in existence back then was a little something called morphine. Ah yes, morphine. The most powerful painkiller the world had ever seen. It was invented back in 1803 and quickly became one of the most widely used drugs by doctors everywhere. It was good for everything from taking away pain from surgery to helping people overcome their opium and alcohol addictions. The only problem was, morphine was actually more addictive than both of those things combined, so alcoholics and opium addicts simply became morphine addicts instead. But this was the 1900s we're talking about, and chemists all over the world were on a roll. Sure, they have replaced opium with morphine and gotten millions of people addicted to this stuff, but surely there had to be some other pain-killing drug that could replace morphine, something just as strong, just as easy to administer, without the bad side effects and addiction. Oh, I know, heroin! In 1874, a British chemist was working on a replacement for morphine when he accidentally created heroin. Luckily, the guy was smart enough to test the stuff and figured out that it was actually a lot stronger and more addictive than morphine, so he scrapped the idea and moved on. Unfortunately, this was long before chemists could just post their findings online for the world to see. So 20 years later, when a Bayer chemist stumbled upon the exact same chemical compound, no one had any idea what it was or how dangerous it would become. But unlike the British chemists, Bayer was not as careful about the drugs it produced. All you saw was a shiny new type of morphine that didn't have any of the bad reputation of morphine. I mean, sure, it was just as strong, and the people you tested it on couldn't get enough of it, but that just meant it was gonna be another bestseller like aspirin, right? So after a few short clinical trials, where you notice heroin didn't just take away pain, it also seemed to take away feelings of anxiety and fear, you named this new drug heroin, after the German word for heroic. And just as quickly, you made the drug available to the public. And as you can imagine, heroin quickly became the best thing you had ever created. I mean, sure, aspirin was great, it was safe, effective, and cheap, but heroin? People were going nuts for the stuff, and you had no idea why. You just thought that your new drug must be better than morphine ever was. So you put all your effort into marketing heroin to everyone, for just about any sickness or symptom you could think of. You even advertised heroin as the perfect cough suppressant for the entire family, kids included. And you weren't totally wrong, heroin did take away your cough almost instantly, but it also left you with a crippling addiction and a long list of life-threatening health problems. But who really cared about that when the average life expectancy back then was just 30-something anyways? Oh, you have a bad cold, a cough that won't go away? Don't worry, one little spoonful of heroin and you'll be as good as new. And as Bayer, you couldn't believe your luck. Your bottles of heroin were flying off the shelves. Doctors were telling people with morphine addictions to try a little heroin. And surprise, surprise, they didn't need morphine to function anymore. They just needed a steady supply of heroin and they would be fine. How was any of this even possible? How could a company as big as Bayer not realize that heroin was even worse than morphine? Simple, you chose not to. Even before you decided to commercialize heroin and sell it to pretty much everyone, there were already rumors swirling around about this new drug turning people into addicts that was even worse than morphine. But you didn't care. Aspirin may have been the perfect wonder drug to kickstart your journey, but the fact that aspirin was safe and non-addictive was just a coincidence. The truth was you didn't care that heroin was ruining people's lives, all you really cared about was the profits. So you pumped out as much heroin as you could for as long as you could, but eventually people caught on. In 1914, the sale and distribution of heroin in America was banned, and it was a big blow to your profits. But if you had learned anything from selling one of the most addictive, dangerous drugs to the general public for years, it was that a big pharma company like you will always find a way to make money. You didn't care about death or suffering or destruction, and as a giant chemical company in 20th century Germany, you were about to find out just how much you could profit from some of the most horrifying events the world had ever witnessed. The exact same year heroin was banned in America, you as Bayer were presented with a unique opportunity. See, while you were busy peddling deadly drugs to coughing babies and their mothers, the world had descended into total chaos. World War I pitted Britain, France, Russia, and America against Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire. But while millions of people were killing each other on the battlefield, back home in Germany, you spotted a giant hole in the marketplace. See, World War I was truly the first modern war, a war that wasn't just won by the number of men you had in your army, but instead by the power and complexity of your weapons. This was a war that used tanks, planes, and even telephones. It was as close to high-tech as anyone back then could have ever imagined. But it also meant that as important as having boots on the ground was, it was equally as important to outsmart and outdevelop your enemy back home. Every country involved in World War I kicked its engineering, biological, and chemical companies into top gear, because the first country to create the most powerful, effective weapons would become the winner. And no country was as hell-bent on winning this arms race as Germany. Within 2 years, the German war machine was moving at full speed, creating all sorts of high-tech weaponry, stuff like anti-tank grenades and machine guns. The companies that jumped on this arms race would be raking in billions from Germany's war funds. And as Bayer, you wanted in. You were already profiting from the war by selling insane amounts of aspirin and heroin to the German army, but you couldn't help but feel like there was some other more specific product that you were missing out on. Obviously, whatever you were gonna create would have to be some sort of chemical, because by the time you tried to switch over to building guns or tanks, the war would be over. So you and 2 other German chemical companies, BASF and Hust, partnered up and started brainstorming. And that's when you came across a brilliant idea. You had spent the last couple of decades trying to cure people's headaches and coughs. And sure, there were some unintended side effects of those drugs, but you never started out meaning any real harm. But now that Germany was at war, everything changed. What if together with your new chemical giant buddies, you could create something that didn't take away coughs and pains, but instead caused coughs and pains? So together, Bayer, BASF, and Hust set up Germany's School of Chemical Warfare. And within less than 1 year into the war, you had your first chemical weapon to show off.
The Germans begin the Second Battle of Ypres by opening the valves on nearly 6,000 chlorine gas cylinders. The gas is piped into no man's land, where a light breeze picks it up. In just 5 minutes, a deadly cloud, 4 miles wide, is drifting towards the French line. Willy Siebert is a gas specialist with the unit deploying the world's first WMD in battle.
As this great cloud of green-gray gas was forming in front of us, we suddenly heard the French yelling.
A French medical officer is among the first victims.
I had the impression that I was looking through green glasses. At the same time, the gas burnt my throat, caused pains in my chest, and made breathing all but impossible.
Together, Bayer and his German chemical company friends created the world's first ever WMD, a weapon of mass destruction. When inhaled, chlorine gas would mix with the water in the soldiers' lungs to form a powerful acid. This acid would burn their lungs from the inside out, leading to a painful death, or in the best case, permanent lung damage. More than 1,100 soldiers died on launch day, and you couldn't have hoped for a better outcome. The German military leaders were ecstatic. Together, you guys were hailed as war heroes. But you didn't stop there. Under the direct command of Karl Duisberg, the guy responsible for bringing aspirin into the world, Bayer went on to help the German war machine by producing mustard gas and phosgene, 2 chemical weapons even more dangerous and deadly than chlorine gas. And sure, your business operations in America and other European countries were quickly getting shut down, but you weren't just a chemical company anymore. You were a full-blown weapons manufacturer. And nothing could compare to the cash and power that came from producing chemical weapons for the German governments. Even though Germany eventually lost the war, you became richer, bigger, and more respected than ever. And in 1925, you decided to make it official. Bayer merged with BASF and Hust to become IG Farben, the biggest pharmaceuticals, dyes, and chemicals conglomerate in the world. Together, you had tasted the profit and influence that came with war profiteering. And you were also smart enough to know that things were everything but peaceful on the German fronts. Somewhere, somehow, in the near future, war would break out again. And when it did, you and your friends at IG Farben would be ready to make even more money than you ever had before. It's late May 1944. 2 twin girls step off a packed cattle train at Auschwitz concentration camp. At just 10 years old, Ava and Miriam Moses have only heard whispers of Auschwitz from frightened family members and friends. Holding tightly onto each other's hands, they have no idea what awaits them. Just a few days earlier, Ava and Miriam had been deported from Hungary with their family. As they shuffle slowly towards the entrance of Auschwitz, they're suddenly singled out by a guard. Shoved into a line of other twins, Ava and Miriam are labeled special, but not in a good way. And as they're about to find out, the horrors of Auschwitz go far beyond gas chambers and starvation. Ava and Miriam have been at Auschwitz for a little over a month, but every day was worse than the last. Ava and Miriam were just another experiment by Dr. Joseph Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death. The twins were nothing more than guinea pigs for his exploration into genetics, medicine, and ways to create the perfect Aryan race by any means necessary. Ava and Miriam were two of over 3,000 twins experimented on by Joseph Mengele. For 8 months, the twin girls were subjected to a never-ending list of torture and medical experimentation. When the Soviets finally liberated their camp on January 27, 1945, they were two of the only 180 children left alive. But what does any of this have to do with Bayer? Well, as it turns out, all the pain and torture Ava and thousands of other prisoners at Auschwitz were going through, it wasn't just connected to Bayer, it was directly because of Bayer that Auschwitz even existed in the first place. After making so much money producing poisonous gases for the German army in World War I, Bayer's villain arc was nearly complete. As a founding member of IG Farben, the biggest chemical conglomerate in Germany, there was no turning back now. So when a young, charismatic Austrian-German politician started making waves in the early 1930s, you, as Bayer through IG Farben, decided to place a bet on what kind of a man it hoped would rule Germany in the near future. So in 1932, IG Farben donated 400,000 Reichsmarks to Adolf Hitler's campaign. That's equivalent to around $2 million today. With so much riding on this little donation to Hitler's campaign, the message was clear. If Hitler won, so would you. But no one expected the bet to pay off so soon. In 1933, Adolf Hitler officially took power, and within months, it was clear that his plans for Germany could only end in war. But thanks to your donation, you were going to make as much money as you possibly could before that happened. So whenever the new German government needed chemicals, drugs, or medical research done, it would turn to IG Farben. And as one of the main members of this conglomerate, a big chunk of that money would come pouring into your coffers. And for a few years, life was good. But as time went by, Hitler's bloodthirsty desire to create a pure Germany took over. And by 1939, Europe once again descended into all-out war. Only this time, you were ready to profit right from the start. In Bayer and IG Farben, Hitler found a company he could rely on to bring his most twisted and horrifying dreams to life. Whatever chemical weapons he needed, you and IG Farben were right there to supply him with it. And as the war, kidnappings, and torture raged on, he finally came to you with the proposal of a lifetime. Help him build and expand Auschwitz, and he would give you all the cheap labor your heart desired. It was an offer better than you could have ever imagined. So as one of the leaders of IG Farben, you gladly accepted. It was IG Farben and Bayer money that built the terrifying Auschwitz III camp, an extension of the main camp with a focus on hard labor. It was IG Farben and Bayer money that paid for the rubber and fuel factory to be built right next door to Auschwitz III. It was IG Farben and Bayer that profited when Hitler sent over 80,000 prisoners from Auschwitz to work in your factories or die. But to many of the people forced to do the backbreaking labor for your profit, death may have been a better option if they had the choice. One survivor of IG Auschwitz Asher Factory came to be known, later wrote that
there was chronic hunger unknown to free men. On the back of my feet, I already had those numb sores that will not heal. I pushed wagons, I worked with a shovel. I turned rotten in the rain. I shivered in the wind.
But that wasn't all. Because as a part of IG Farben, you weren't just profiting from using slave labor with Hitler's blessing. You were making even more money selling a long list of chemicals and drugs to the Nazis. Zyklon B, the gas used by Nazis to kill millions in concentration camps. Yeah, it was originally used as a pesticide, for which IG Farben held the patent. But when the Nazis realized they could use it to kill people, you had zero hesitation changing its intended purpose from killing weeds to enabling genocide. Over the years, you made millions manufacturing and supplying Zyklon B so the Nazis could do their thing. But those weren't the only chemicals you sold either. Remember Ava and Miriam, the two girls who were tortured by the Angel of Death for 8 months? Yet none of those experiments the doctor performed would have been possible without you. According to Ava, the experiments that nearly killed her, that left her falling in and out of consciousness as she crawled across the floor, were under the direct supervision of Bayer. And all those injections the doctors at Auschwitz gave her, they had been infecting her with a series of different diseases just so they could test the effectiveness of Bayer's drugs. Each time the Nazi doctors injected Ava with a new disease, and then followed it up with one of Bayer's drugs, Bayer was directly monitoring and supervising the experiments. That way you could have a better idea of how well your drugs worked and what needed to be changed. And it wasn't just kids. In the crowded conditions of Auschwitz, anyone who wasn't killed early on would inevitably get sick. And when they did, Bayer would send over a bunch of unmarked medicines for testing. And most of the time, these medicines didn't work and only made the prisoners suffer more. And if that wasn't horrifying enough, witnesses later told of another case where Bayer bought 150 women prisoners from the Nazis to use in an experiment for a new narcotic drug. The letters between Bayer and Nazi leadership allegedly went something like this.
We confirm your response, but consider the price of 200 Reichsmarks per woman to be too high. We propose to pay no more than 170 Reichsmarks per woman. We confirm your approval of the agreements. Please prepare us 150 women in the best health possible. Receive the order of 150 women. Despite their macerated condition, they were considered satisfactory. We will keep you informed of the developments regarding the experiments. The experiments were performed. All test persons died. We will contact you shortly about new shipments.
Within the space of a few decades, Bayer had gone from a chemical company that brought the world aspirin to one of the cruelest businesses to ever exist. There was no denying that you were directly responsible for the deaths of millions under Hitler's rule. So when Germany finally lost the war, Bayer, IG Farben must have been severely punished, right? Well, not exactly. Because when everything was said and done, only 24 IG Farben executives were ever held accountable for their role in the murder of millions of innocent people. And of those 24, only 13 were given prison sentences. And not even long prison sentences at that. These were people who knowingly profited from torture, enslavement, and deaths. And yet, according to the prosecutors, they got sentences light enough to please a chicken thief. By the early 1950s, most of the 13 executives who were actually sent to prison were right back to leading the companies that made up IG Farben. See, once the war ended, there was no way IG Farben could still be an actual conglomerate. Their reputation was in the gas chamber. So to keep their money and business interests safe, all the companies that had come together to form IG Farben in 1925 simply just split up again. They split back up into Bayer, BASF, and Host. Fritz Timir was an IG Farben executive throughout World War II. He became a Nazi Party member in 1937. He was the person responsible for the IG Farben factory in Auschwitz. He also visited Auschwitz several times and reported everything he saw, and yet he was only sentenced to 7 years in jail for his role in the murder of millions of people. And that was the longest sentence given to an IG Farben executive, by the way. Except he didn't even serve all of it. Instead, he was out just 2 years later due to good behavior. And by 1956, he was elected chairman of the board at, you guessed it, the one and only Bayer. Without Bayer and IG Farben, Germany's war would not have been possible. And yet they got nothing more than a slap on the wrist. It wasn't even until 1995 that anyone at Bayer even acknowledged what the company had made possible. And even then, it was just a half-assed apology to one Holocaust victim at a random lecture in Pittsburgh. It wasn't even an official apology. It was just one Bayer executive who felt guilty of having to introduce a Holocaust survivor to the audience. And with so much evil already under its belt, this had to be the end of Bayer's villain era, right? I mean, what could be worse than giving Hitler the power to kill millions of innocent people? Obviously, Bayer had to be on the straight and narrow from here on out, right? Well, again, not really, because the Bayer rabbit hole goes much, much deeper than that. What could Bayer possibly do to top what it's already done? Well, in the mid-1980s, one of Bayer's laboratories was working on a new drug to treat hemophilia. Hemophilia is a rare type of genetic disorder where your blood doesn't clot, so you could bleed out from a tiny cut if you're not careful. One of the components of the new drug was something called Factor VIII. Factor VIII is harvested from the blood plasma of healthy people, but apparently, buying blood plasma from 100% healthy people was just too pricey for Bayer. So instead of ensuring the blood plasma it used was completely safe, Bayer ignored the possible risk of using blood from someone with a disease like HIV, so they just blindly harvested Factor VIII from the cheapest sources. And as it turns out, many of the samples Bayer ended up using were in fact contaminated with HIV. Bayer knew this, but since destroying all the HIV-contaminated drugs meant losing a lot of money, the company came up with a brilliant solution. Sell the contaminated drugs to poorer countries in South America and Asia, and then use that money to make safer versions to sell in Europe and the US. Very on brand for Bayer, right? So while Bayer pocketed millions for selling more than 100,000 vials of his tainted hemophilia drug to unsuspecting people around the world, at least 100 people in just Hong Kong and Taiwan were infected with HIV after using the drug, and thousands of others probably also got infected, but never connected the dots back to Bayer's drug. Many of the people who developed HIV after using Bayer's drugs died, but why would the company care? By 1990, it was number 91 on the Fortune 500 list. It was making more than $5 billion a year, or around $12 billion in today's money. They had already killed millions of people. What was another couple thousand? What difference would it make? And just like Bayer's war crimes during World War II, eventually the stories about it knowingly infecting people with HIV just kinda went away. Sure, you had to pay a couple $100 million here and there to settle a few lawsuits, but what's a few $100 million when you're making billions every year? It seems like every decision Bayer made, every step it took, was pulling even further and further into the dark side, if that was even possible. By the time the world learned it had been selling HIV-contaminated drugs to thousands of people, it seemed like that had to be the limit. No company could get worse than that, right? But as it turns out, Bayer had one more trick up its sleeve. Look, Bayer has done a long list of seriously questionable stuff, but that is all in the past, at least according to Bayer. Infecting people with HIV, making the Holocaust possible, all of those things happened at a time when the line between good and evil was a lot more blurred. You can't blame us for things that happened like 40 years ago. It was a simpler time back then. And scrolling through the company's official website, it's easy to fall for their "we want to make the world a better place" narrative. But if Bayer really was reformed, if they really did care about making the world a better place, why on earth would they have done this a few years ago? Yup, Monsanto. Monsanto is kind of like the American version of Bayer, only it was an agricultural company first, and a chemical company second. We've got a private documentary on Monsanto that you can check out if you want to see more messed up stuff, but thanks to Monsanto we have Agent Orange, Roundup, and in 2018 with full knowledge of Monsanto's dark history and all the lawsuits piling up, Bayer decided to buy Monsanto for a whopping $63 billion in cash. And in retrospect, it really is the perfect acquisition for Bayer. Just like Bayer, Monsanto always gets away with it. And thanks to Monsanto, it's now time for Bayer to expand into a new industry, our food. So if you thought Monsanto was bad before, wait until you see what Bayer turns it into next. Companies like Bayer are a big reason why we are so much sicker today than ever before. You eat processed food sprayed with Bayer's Monsanto pesticides, which is linked to an increased risk in cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma cancer to be specific, and what do you know? Then you're conveniently put on Bayer's drug for that cancer. And the cycle continues. This is why it's so important to remove as many toxins from your life as possible. This includes not only the food you eat, but the chemicals you expose yourself to, which includes your skincare. The Environmental Working Group surveyed over 2,300 men and women, and they found that the average man uses 6 skincare products daily, exposing them to 85 different chemicals, while the average woman uses 12 products a day, exposing themselves to 168 different chemicals. And you wonder why cancer is increasing. You wonder why testosterone and sperm count in men is decreasing. You wonder why more and more women are becoming infertile. Also that these skincare conglomerates can get even richer. And that is why we created Evil Goods. Evil Goods is an all-natural moisturizer made with the highest quality beef tallow and other natural super ingredients like Manuka honey, so that you can replace your face creams, body lotions, and more with an all-natural solution that actually works. That way you can save money and save your hormones at the same time. The last time I brought this up, I said we changed the lives of over 100,000 people already, but I was wrong. Evil Goods has actually already changed the lives of over 250,000 people already. 250,000 people that now have clearer skin where nothing else has worked for them, they have more confidence now and most importantly, better health. So if you haven't tried it already, my favorite scent is a citrus scent. I'll link it below. All you gotta do is scroll down right now, click the link below and subscribe. And by subscribing, you'll get a 30% discount on your first purchase and 15% off all of your next shipments. So scroll down, click the link below, click subscribe, and join the over 250,000 people that are giving the middle finger to big skincare right now.